In this video, we're going to work out where the beats go in my arrangement of Beethoven's Ode to Joy from my intermediate classical course. And in doing so, we're going to hopefully work out as much about rhythmic notation in general as possible just by studying this one score. And we're going to start with just 3 rules about rhythm which apply to all scores. Now, these rules are written in my article, Reading Rhythm Part 3, Counting Beats in Bars. So this is the context for the video. If you've come across this video on YouTube or elsewhere, follow the link in the description and it'll take you to the complete tutorial because it gives you the context, like you're going to need this chart and so on. And also it's part 3 of currently about a 12-part course on reading rhythm in music. So you need to have done parts 1 and 2, the previous 2 tutorials, in order to have the context to make sense of this video. So do that first if you haven't. Assuming you're watching it in context, then you know the context, you'll have read these rules already. And these rules apply to all pieces. So the first rule is the first note after a bar line is always on the first beat of the bar. Second is the length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. And the third rule is if 2 notes are vertically above each other on the staff, they're played at the same time. And in these 3 rules, every time I've had the word note, I have an asterisk pointing out that it can be a note or a rest. We don't have any rests in Beethoven's Ode to Joy, in this arrangement at least, so that doesn't apply to this tutorial. You can forget about rest for the time being. We're going to cover rest in a later tutorial, but rests are basically just kind of placeholders in scores telling you not to play anything for a certain length of time. But don't worry about rest for the time being. You can ignore these asterisks next to the word note. So this is not a huge amount of information to start with in terms of reading rhythm, but as you'll see as we work through this tutorial, you can actually work out a lot about rhythm notation just from these 3 rules. We have one other piece of information, which is this bit here. It says in this particular piece, the bottom note of the time signature is a 4, so that means that a quarter note is 1 beat. So this is from my note length chart, which was in the previous tutorial. It's further down the page on this one. It sounds a bit complicated, but if we just recap that, in my note length chart, it says that this 4th column is true. Got an asterisk here. 4th column is true if the bottom number of the time signature is a 4. So if the bottom number of the time signature is a 4, and it is in Ode to Joy, there we go, bottom number is 4, as is the top number, then this right-hand column is true, which means that a quarter note, this note here, a quarter note, is 1 beat. So just to go up to that piece of information higher up, it says that a quarter note is 1 beat, which means that in Beethoven's Ode to Joy, this is a quarter note. A quarter note is basically a note where the head is filled in and it has a stem, as opposed to, say, this note here, the head is empty and it doesn't have a stem. If the head is filled in and it has a stem, that is 1 beat in this particular score because the bottom note is a 4. That's a very weird sounding rule if you're new to sight reading. It's going to make sense when we get to time signatures, which is much later on in the course. But for the time being, you'll just have to kind of take this on trust that for this piece, and in fact for most pieces in popular music, not for every piece in classical music, but most pieces in popular music, a quarter note is 1 beat. So that's why I put the word usually here. It's usually true, especially if you're playing popular music, but not always true. So I have to include that caveat. So let's go over these rules one by one and then see what we can work out about this score. Because as I mentioned in the previous tutorial, in music notation, beats are not notated at all, which is infuriating. There is not a single symbol on this page that tells you where a beat is. You have to kind of work out where the beats go based on sort of the bar lines and the note lengths and so on. So we're going to go through this score and write in the beats for each bar. 4 beats in each bar. We're just going to write them down 1, 2, 3, 4 all the way through the score. And as we do so, hopefully we'll make sense of what kind of note this is or this one is, what that dot means, and so on. So let's go over those rules one by one. We went over them pretty quickly before, but we'll have more time to think about them now. So 3 rules for all pieces. The first rule says that the first note after a bar line is always on the first beat of the bar. Well, first of all, we need to know what a bar line is. So in the score, a bar line is one of these vertical lines. So this is a bar line. If I can draw on top of them, that's a bar line. That's another one. That's another bar line, and so on. These are all bar lines. We have one at the beginning here. So Do not confuse these with beats in this diagram we had in the previous tutorial. This is a completely different way of representing music that kind of echoes the way that music's represented in music programs like GarageBand and so on. So this is a pitch time graph, and beats here are points in time. So beats are vertical lines. That is not what bar lines are. This is a different way of representing music, and this line does not represent one beat. In fact, nothing happens on this line. Bar lines in music notation are just ways of dividing up the score to make it easier to read. So for instance, as a side note, Satie's Nocien, which is also, or Nocien number 1, which is also arranged in my intermediate classical course, was originally published with no bar lines. It just had a kind of unending stream of notes which weren't divided up at all, and it was still perfectly possible to read it rhythmically. So you could actually take out these lines and the music would be played exactly the same way. They kind of sort of help you read the score rather than have a particular function. So anyway, that's a bar line. It's basically a line dividing two bars. So this is bar 1, this is bar 2, bar 3, bar 4, and these bars are divided by bar lines. So back to the rule. The rule was the first note after a bar line, we now know what that is always on the first beat of the bar. Always on the first beat of the bar. So if you're writing beats into bars, you can always write beat number 1 really easily. So this is a bar line here. So the first note after the bar line is on beat 1. So we can write 1 there. That is where beat 1 goes in this bar. So that's true for this note. It's also true for this note. So this note is also the first note after the bar line. So that goes on beat 1. And in the next bar, first note after the bar line goes on beat 1. Do that in this bar as well. I should point out the very first bar in the score is sometimes an incomplete bar, a partial bar. You can tell that because if you add up all the beats, they add up to fewer than the number of beats indicated by the time signature. That happens in Brahms's Lullaby in the next tutorial. However, in this case, we have that's 1, 2, 3, 4 notes, and there are 4 beats in the bar. So this is a complete bar. So that is on the first beat of the bar as well. And we won't do every single bar on the score, but you get the idea. You could just write a 1 underneath the first note in every bar. So that's where beat 1 goes. That's always like a no-brainer. If you're working out the beats in bars, you can always work out where beat 1 goes. Second rule is the length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. So the length of, for instance, this note tells us when this note is happening. That's really crucial. It's a kind of counterintuitive thing in music notation, but the length of this note doesn't tell you when to play this note. If you want to know when to play this note, you need to know the length of this note. So that's why I italicize next here. The length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. So as we established earlier, a quarter note is 1 beat. This is a 1 beat note. So this tells us when this note is happening. This note is happening the moment this note finishes. So if we have a 1 beat note, the next note, well, let's go back to this diagram from the previous tutorial. Here is a 1 beat note right here. It's a different way of representing notes. If we see beats as vertical lines, in other words, if we see beats as points in time, and a 1 beat note is starting on a beat, then it's going to finish exactly on the next beat. It's a 1 beat note, which means that the next note, because it's starting the moment this one finishes, the next note is going to start on the next beat. So if this note here starts on beat 1 and is 1 beat long, then the next note is going to start on beat 2. That is a very detailed analysis of beats, which you might have guessed a little quicker than I went through it, but that's such an important point, I wanted to go over it. Just that thing that, this note here could be 1,000,000 beats long, and it wouldn't affect when you play it. It would affect how long you hold it for. You'd hold it for the rest of your life, but it would still come at the same point because, again, the length of this note doesn't tell you when to play it. When you play this note depends on this note. This is a 1 beat note, starts on the first beat of the bar, so the next note comes on the second beat of the bar. And then we can apply that logic to all of the other notes, right? So this is a 1 beat note. So again, I think this is a good way of picturing it. That's why I include this diagram. If we have a 1 beat note, if it's starting on a beat, then the next note is coming on the next beat. So this is going to go on beat 3. This is going to go on beat 4. Should explain it. I'm writing with a trackpad, so I'm kind of writing like a 5-year-old. My handwriting, I promise, is better in real life. And actually, we have like a string of 1-beat notes in the right hand for the first 3 bars. We have 12 in a row, so we can write in all of the beats just underneath each of these notes, right? So not a very good 4, but let's stick with it. 3. Oh my goodness, need more practice at this. Okay. So if you were doing this yourself, you could print off the score and write in these beats with pencil. I recommend pencil, of course, in case you make a mistake and want to erase one and correct it. So we have the beats for the first 3 bars. Here we don't have any 1-beat notes. We don't know what these are yet. At least we're pretending not to know what they are. We actually saw them in the note chart before. We have a sort of a 1-beat note, but with a dot after it, so that may affect it. We haven't covered this yet either. So we don't know how to put the beats in this bar yet. But let's work through some other bars and then come back to this later. Maybe we'll be able to work it out later. So that covers the point. The second rule, the length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. So that's how we worked out all of these beats. We just knew that this was on the first beat of the bar. We knew how long it is, and it allowed us to work out when this note happened. And then we knew how long this note was, which allowed us to know when this note happened, and so on. And we have this kind of string so that when each beat is happening is depending on the length of the previous one. So now rule 3, if 2 notes are vertically above each other on the staff, they're played at the same time. So if 2 notes are vertically above each other on the staff, they're played at the same time. So for instance, these 2 notes here are vertically above each other, so they're going to get played at the same time. That's always true of music notation. And note that I say on the staff because the way we read music, let's maybe change. Okay, let's change to this tool. The way you read a score is like this. You're reading the first line from left to right. It's going to be very messy for a moment. And then you jump to the beginning of the next line. Then you read the next line left to right, kind of like you would, lines in a book. And then you jump to the beginning of the next line and so on. So you're going to zigzag across the page like this, which means that, for instance, this note here, this note does not get played at the same time as this note because they are on different staffs, right? So because you're not playing them at the same time, you play this one a long time after this one because you go through this line first and then you go through this line. So this note does not happen at the same time as this one. However, let's just take those arrows away. Because these 2 are on the same staff, they're on the same line, these 2 happen at the same time. Okay, so let's go back to this tool. So that's important. So now let's use this rule and work out some stuff that's going on. If 2 notes are vertically above each other on the staff, they're played at the same time. So first of all, that's why we can write the beats in the middle of the line. Because if we write the beats correctly for the right hand, they're also going to be in the correct place for the left hand because everything's vertically aligned. So for instance, if we look at, let's look at this bar here, bar number 3. So these 2 notes get played at the same time, and then these 2 notes get played at the same time. But that means that we know that this note gets played on beat number 3, which is kind of shadily written. But this note goes on beat number 3. We didn't work that out based on this note. We just know that because we know that this note gets played at the same time as this note, and we know that this one goes on beat number 3 because it comes after these 2 1-beat notes. So if this note is getting played on beat number 3 and this one's getting played on beat number 1, well, this note is getting played 2 beats after this one. So we know that this note, this note must be a 2-beat note. So that's not the beat number, that is how long this note is. That is a 2-beat note. So let's take away that circle. Let's just write 2 there. This is a 2-beat note. So if we have a note which kind of looks like a quarter note, but the head is empty rather than being filled in, we know that it's a 2-beat note rather than a 1-beat note. And this is what I meant by, if we analyze this score starting from a few beginning rules, we can actually work out other elements of music notation. You can look at this score and just by using sheer logic work out that this symbol is a 2-beat note if this is a 1-beat note. And that actually helps us with this bar over here, right? So this is a 2-beat note. It starts on beat 1 and 2 beats after beat 1, 1, 2 is going to be beat 3. So we know that this note here is happening on beat 3, and therefore also this one. And that means that, of course, we then know that beat 4 has to go here. So we just don't know where beat 2 goes next. But we know from this bar that this symbol is a 2-beat note, and therefore this note goes on beat 3. So let's analyze a few more bars. If we look at this bar, bar number 1, we have 4 1-beat notes in the right hand. In the left hand, we just have this one note, which is taking up the entire bar, because this note is going to last until this one gets played. That's going back to rule 2 again. Rule 2. The length of a note tells you when the next note is happening. So this note is coming after this one. This one lasts for 4 beats because this note is 1, 2, 3, 4 beats after this one. So this must be a 4-beat note. So if we have an empty head with no stem on it, that is a 4-beat note. So we actually now know the symbols for a 1-beat note, a 2-beat note, and a 4-beat note. So a 1-beat note is the one we started with. If the head's filled in with a stem, it's a 1-beat note. If the head is empty with a stem, it's a 2-beat note. And then if you just have an empty head with no stem, it's a 4-beat note. So let's move on to this one. Let's look at this bar, bar number 2. Well, again, using that rule that 2 notes are above each other vertically, they're happening at the same time. We know that this note is happening on beat number 4, which means that this note has to be 3 beats long. Okay, this is a 3-beat long note, which is basically a 2-beat long note with a dot after it. So if you take a 2-beat long note and put a dot after it, you get a 3-beat long note. Seems like there's some kind of rule or convention there, but we'll come back to that later. So now, if we look at the next line, you can check this for yourself, but the next line is basically rhythmically extremely similar to the first line. In fact, it's literally identical for the first 3 bars, and this just has a couple of notes different. So we're not going to learn anything much new from the second line. Let's instead go to the third line and look at this bar here, so bar number 10. Well, okay, straight away we can put in 1. That's rule number 1 again. I'm going to repeat myself a lot just so this information gets stuck in your head. The first note after a bar line is always on the first beat of the bar, so we can do that straight away. Second rule, the length of a note tells you when the next note is happening, so same logic, 1-beat note, so this is beat 2. We can work out where beat 3 goes because we know that this is a 2-beat note, so this is going to happen on beat 3. This also means that this note goes on beat 3. Let's just improve that 3. There we go. And then this is a 1-beat note, so that's going to go on beat 4. So we worked out where the 4 beats go. So then what's going on with these 2 notes here? Well, we know that between this note here and this note is 1 beat. So we know that these 2 notes have to fit into 1 beat. And they're also identical. I mean, they kind of look like quarter notes, but they have this line joining them. I'll call it a tail. So we know that these 2 notes have to fit into 1 beat and they're equal length. So that beat has to be divided into 2. So each of these notes is a half beat note. So that basically gives us the rule that if we have what looks like a quarter beat note and then we add a tail to it, it becomes a half beat note. So this note is going to go halfway between beat 2 and beat 3. And the way we notate that when you're annotating a score is with a plus sign. And then you're going to pronounce this and. So if you're counting the beats in this bar, you're going to go 1, 2, and 3, 4. Okay, which actually matches your intuition of the tune. So if you know the tune, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, and 3, 4. That's what that and is. I'm probably singing that at the wrong pitch, and I'm also not a very good singer, but hopefully that sounded familiar if you know the tune to Ode to Joy. You can also, of course, have a video of this on my site, so you can look up the video and then match all of these beats to what the piece actually sounds like. So that gives us a useful piece of information. We know that this note is a half beat note. So basically a quarter beat note with a tail is a half beat note. So we're actually, working out quite a lot of note lengths. We know a 1 beat note, 2 beat note, 3 beat note, 4 beat note, and now a half beat note. And we have one of those in bar 4, which we still need to complete. This thing here is a quarter note with a tail on it. In other words, a 1 beat note with a tail in it. So this is a half beat note. So that is going to start a half beat before beat 3, which means that it's going to, if it's just a half beat before beat 3, it's going to have to come in the middle of the beat, or rather between beats 2 and 3. So it's going to come on an off beat like this note. Well, we can work it out. It's exactly the same situation. This is a half beat note before beat 3, and it goes on an and. So this is going to go on an and here. It's going to go on the off beat before beat 3, which means we now know where beat 2 goes. Beat 2 has to go in this empty space here. So nothing's getting played on beat 2. We're just holding these two notes. But we now know that this goes on 2.5 or 2 and. 1, 2, and 3, 4. This goes on the and, which now gives us another piece of information, which is this note. This note is taking us from beat 1 to beat 2.5. So this note here must be 1.5 beats long. It's the last thing we worked out. So a 1 beat note with a dot is 1.5 beats long. Well, we actually already have information about dots, right? A 2 beat note with a dot is 3 beats long. But a 1 beat note with a dot is 1.5 beats long. So what is the dot doing? Well, it seems like the dot is multiplying the length of a note by 1.5. So let's just take this note. This is a 1 beat note here. A 1 beat note with a dot becomes a 1.5 beat note, and a 2 beat note with a dot becomes a 3 beat note. So 1 times 1.5 is 1.5. That's fairly obvious. 2 times 1.5 is 3. Half of 2 is 1, and then 2 plus 1 is 3. And that is actually what a rhythm dot does. If you put a dot after a note, it multiplies the length of that note by 1.5. So that was all pretty slow. That's because, of course, we're new to rhythm notation. You might get the feeling from this video that reading rhythm is always going to be this slow. That's not the case. The more you work through examples, the more you get used to this, and eventually you'll be able to read rhythm pretty automatically, and ideally even sight read stuff in time, which is amazing. But the reason I wanted to work through this video so thoroughly is, first of all, to kind of make the whole notation system more intuitive, because, you know, to me, this is a more intuitive way of seeing rhythm, to be able to actually see the beats and then see notes as sort of horizontal bars, basically horizontal lines. So you can see exactly how long they are. That's not what we get with sort of traditional music notation. We can't really see how long these notes are. We just have these different ways of notating them, you know, filling in the heads or adding stems or putting tails on them, like this note, which tells us how long they are. And then, as I say, that tells you when the next note is happening. That's really a pretty bad system. If you were like designing music notation from scratch, you wouldn't design music notation that way. But then, as I say, this is all derived from sort of medieval monks and Gregorian chant. That's how they wrote down their music, and that tradition has just continued, and we're still using a sort of modified version of the same system. So it's pretty inefficient and quite confusing. But as you can see, once you kind of understand how it works, if you really think it through, you can actually work out a lot. So even if you have a bar like this one, where you can't work out what's going on, you know, you can always maybe sort of go to other parts of the score and analyze stuff, and then maybe come back to it, and it'll make more sense. And even sometimes here, we kind of went backwards a little bit. We filled in the second half of this bar before we filled in the first part of this bar. Same with this one. And that's another trick you can use if you're working out rhythms. If you can't work out a bit, maybe work out the bit after it, and then maybe working backwards, you'll get the bit in between. And also, I just wanted to point out that, you know, if you ever forget, you know, how many notes, beats long this note is, or this one, you can maybe work it out from the context. Or especially, you know, in this case as well, if you work out the right hand, then that tells you exactly when you're playing all of these left hand notes. The right hand is kind of giving you a grid in this particular piece of, you know, one note happening every beat. So then when you look at the left hand, you can tell when all of the bass notes go. You just get them to correspond with the correct note in the right hand. So hopefully that demystified music notation a fair amount. If we go back to the note length chart, which was in the previous tutorial, here it is again. We just started with this one. I said that this was 1 beat, and then we worked out a bunch of these other notes. We worked out that this was 2 beats. We worked out that this was 4 beats, which is the fourth column here in the chart. And then we worked out that this was half a beat. And we also worked out that, I put this at the bottom, that a dot multiplies, it's called a dotted note, a dot multiplies the length of a note by 1.5 beats, and we're going to cover that in a later tutorial.